Welcome back. You are tuned in to Traders Nation. My pleasure to have with us here today book author Jonah Lehrer, How We Decide. Jonah, welcome to Traders Nation. How are you today?
Good. How are you? Thanks so much for having me.
Doing fantastic. Thanks. How true is it that our brains, reasoning centers, are easily fooled, Jonah?
They are very easily fooled.
Yeah.
It turns out we're pretty gullible creatures. I think one of the examples I talk about in the book is just how our expectations often profoundly influence what we actually experience. So I talk about some really clever studies done on how people taste wine. Some scientists did some wine tasting experiments in a brain scanner and found that when you tell people they're drinking an expensive wine, a $90 bottle of California Cabernet, but even give them a $5 bottle of wine, so the really cheap stuff, they will say this $5 bottle of wine tastes delicious. They talk about, they wax poetic about it, just because they think it's $90, even though it's actually some cheap, plonk, one of the stuff that comes in those big glass bottles.
$2 Chuck.
So and you can see changes in the brain.
Yeah.
And when you give people all these different wines completely blind to taste, they actually prefer the $5 wine. It's simply, they simply think it's so great when it's $90.
Right. All right. So preset expectations we can fool ourselves with that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This is just the consumer version of the placebo effect, which is when you give people a sugar pill, then it magically makes their headache go away. The fact is, we constantly have expectations about what we're going to taste or experience or feel, and these expectations really do influence what we actually taste and feel.
Right, all right. Now, in some instances where decisions are really critical, for example, you're in war, you see the enemy, they're pointing down at you, you need to do something rather quickly, you need to make a decision. How does the brain process this so fast?
Well, in the book, I asked the same question by looking at how NFL quarterbacks make decisions. At first glance, it seems like an incredibly difficult decision. You've got 3.5, maybe 4 seconds to find the open man, to find the best receiver. Meanwhile, you've got 21 other players you got to watch. You got to keep an eye out for the linebackers, the cornerbacks, the safeties, the pass rush. I mean, there's so many variables to consider. So how does an NFL quarterback actually make a decision?
Right.
I think the old theory is that, they're just, they think very quickly. They're rational creatures, and so they carefully take everything into account. But it turns out, if you ask a quarterback, they're not consciously aware of where the safety is or where the linebacker is. There's just too much information for their conscious brain to take into account. So what happens is their unconscious keeps track of all the different variables of all the players. And then it generates emotions, these subtle feelings that tell them where to throw the ball. So when you ask an NFL quarterback like Tom Brady, how did you know to throw the ball to the wide receiver streaking down the sideline? He'll often say, I don't know, it just felt right. In the same way, when you ask a baseball hitter, a professional baseball hitter, how did you decide to swing at that pitch? They can't explain why. They're not consciously aware of the very subtle cues they're picking up from the pitcher, how he's holding the ball or the torque of his wrist or whatever, and yet the brain is able to act on this information. So I think these kinds of very quick decisions show us that we often know more than we know. We know more than we're consciously aware of, and by acting on this information, we can often make shockingly effective decisions.
Well, isn't this one, it's got to come back down to experience, too. That's got to be a part of the play, but also taking in all that information, scanning the field, seeing who's open, got guys rushing me, and then we come to the gut. Is there a gut feeling that's involved here? Don't these all play simultaneously? Don't all the engines, don't the pistons just fire off that come down to one decision and bang-o?
Yeah, I think experience is the key thing. Obviously, if you put me in the position of Tom Brady or an NFL quarterback, I'm going to get sacked every time.
Right.
I haven't taken the time to train my brain. I can't hit a 90-mile-per-hour fastball. You only learn how to pick up on these very subtle cues and how to act on these feelings through experience and deliberate practice and years of training.
Right.
So number one, experience is key. And number two, I do think there is this welter of activity. There are all these things happening in your brain, throughout your body, and the key, and this is the point I really stress in the book, is to know when to rely on these different modes of thought. When should we really try to be rational, and when should we really trust our gut?
Right, and another thing would be sense. Of course, you can hear them. Your senses of hearing can hear them rushing up on you. All right, so let's talk about situations where time is less pressing, okay? It seems to allow for rational space to operate. Is that true?
Yeah, certainly. Most of our decisions we don't have to make in 3.5 seconds. Most of our decisions we can, take some time and try to figure out which car we should buy or which cereal we should buy in the supermarket or whatever. These are leisurely decisions, and we do have the luxury of thought. I think one of the perversities of this is that one of the big problems, I think, that so many people make in everyday decision-making, is the problem I'm very, very vulnerable to myself, is the problem of thinking too much. You know, you overthink your options. And what that often leads you to do is come up with reasons that may sound good, and yet there's lots of experimental evidence that a lot of the reasons we come up with, the reasons we should prefer this toothpaste over the other toothpaste or buy this car over the other car, are actually misleading, actually lead us to make the wrong decisions.
Right.
And this gets back to the inherent processing limitations of your rational brain, which is based in a brain area called prefrontal cortex. Your rational brain can only take in about 7 pieces of information at any given moment. You give it more than that, and it's forced to start cherry-picking facts and information.
Yeah, now, again, I want to come back to you touched on something. You can actually get paralysis through analysis. If you've got too much time to think about anything, you can render yourself really ineffective, right?
Absolutely. I talk in the book about some really seminal work done by a neurologist named Antonio Damasio, who in the early 80s began studying patients who lost the ability to experience emotion. So you'd think if, you were Plato or a modern economist, that these people would be the best decision makers ever, because they'd be purely rational, perfectly rational, no impulsive emotions leading them astray. They just think clearly and deliberately all the time. Instead, what you find is these people become pathologically indecisive, that they'll spend all day trying to figure out where to eat lunch.
Kind of like Congress.
They're
kind of like
the Senate, basically, but a brain.
Yes,
and the reason is because they'll just sit there all day coming up with reasons to prefer one option to another and vice versa. So you give them a blue pen or a black pen and ask them to sign a patient consent form, they'll spend an hour going back and forth. The form's in black, so maybe they should sign in blue to stick out, but maybe blue will stick out too much.
Yeah.
You can come up with reasons for just about anything.
Crazy.
And some of these reasons are valid and some aren't.
That's crazy. The fringe is not straight enough. All right. At some point, you got to move on, though, right, Joan? I mean, let's face it, you got to be able to move. You got to recognize when you've got paralysis through analysis. All right, so what part of the gut instinct plays into the decision-making process? We just touched about that a second ago on briefly. So what part does the gut instinct play? Because we all have that feeling, don't we?
Yeah, well, these emotional signals coming from your unconscious can often be very wise and very effective, and they can also lead you astray. The worst decision-making advice you could give someone is to say always trust your gut, because trusting your gut also leads you to take out subprime mortgages you can't afford and spend too much on your credit card and and do all sorts of irresponsible, reckless things.
Sure.
So the key isn't to simply always rely on one mode of thinking or the other. I think for too long, people have written too many books about, and given too many, self-help seminars about just always trust your gut or always be rational. Both of those pieces of advice are really bad. The key is to know when to use which mode of thought in which situation. That certain situations benefit from, being rational, and certain situations benefit from being more emotional.
Right. Trust your gut doesn't always mean feed it. All right.
Just exactly.
All right, how often do people trick themselves into thinking that they're sure of something when the fact of the matter is they're not?
Well, this is a very big decision-making flaw. The fact of the matter is that the brain loves to be certain, and this is a consequence of the fact that we've got all these different brain areas stuffed inside our head, which are often telling us to do different things. One brain area is saying, eat the chocolate cake, and the other is saying, don't eat the chocolate cake, you're on a diet. and at any given moment, there's this argument taking place inside our head.
Yeah.
And this means that we love to feel certain, because that means we can shut the argument off. We can stop thinking about it and just choose already. Yeah. So we love to believe we're right, which is, why liberals watch MSNBC and conservatives watch Fox News. It feels nice to have your preconceived beliefs confirmed. The problem is that this often leads us to neglect relevant information which might actually help us correct our beliefs, change our beliefs.
Sure. All right. Now, Jonah, where can we find a copy of How We Decide? Where can we get a copy today?
It should be in all major bookstores, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, stuff like that, places like that.
Appreciate that. Jonah Lehrer with us here today. How We Decide, a very awesome book. Check it out today. Head out to Barnes & Noble, Amazon.com, or your local bookstore. All right. Jonah, thanks for being with us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're more than welcome. How We Decide, get a copy today. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.